Welcome to e-Pathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Associate Professor, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidya-mitra, Pune. Today we are going to look at a module titled Class, Caste and Power, Weber on India. This particular module comes under the paper Classical Sociological Theory. Until now, we have looked at how Weber understood the idea of legitimacy and power and authority, and how he understood various kinds of leadership models. Scholars in India have used the Weberian approach to understand the relationship between caste, class and power in India. It is no surprise that there is a ruling class in India. This is a Marxist perspective, and this ruling class consists of coalitions, and one such coalition is based in terms of interaction between the caste and class in rural India, and this caste dimension is basically of the dominant caste, and it also has class expectations. So this matrix of and dynamics of relations are captured in this particular module. Weber on the concept of caste. According to Weber, in India, caste was a central fact of the social structure, just as the relationship between kinship and bureaucracy. Caste has been defined earlier in terms of distinctive style of life. In terminology of Weber, they constitute status groups. In contrast to classes, Weber writes, status groups are normally communities. They are, however, of an amorphous kind. The caste of India established a direct link between religious beliefs and social differentiation of society, a link that as most other societies were indirect. Weber emphasized this contrast by considering caste in relation to the sects and churches of Western civilization. Caste share with the Protestant sects the elements of social exclusiveness. The person who violates a ritual of his caste may be ostracized, so that the members of the caste, including his own parents and relatives, will terminate all contact with him. A caste differs from the religious sect in that membership does not depend on individual religious qualification but his birth. In the Catholic communities too, individuals are born into the church, but unlike the caste members, are recruited only from the particular social group, and they do not aim at the conversion of the non-believers. According to the caste, combine religious beliefs with rigid observances of status differences. They are exclusive communities of persons whose social status is indicated by birth and who share the same status by virtue of their ritual practices. Weber saw caste as special social group. In all societies, such group maintain their identity by enforcing restrictions upon intermarriage and social intercourse with persons who do not belong. The castes are hereditary status groups whose restrictive practices are unparalleled both in the degree to which they erect barriers among members of different castes and in detail with which they regulate the life of the individual. Weber says, adopting a slogan from the Communist Manifesto, the Hindu of a very low caste can win the world. According to the Weber, marriage between high caste girl and low caste man was prohibited. As a result, high caste girls are restricted to men of their own caste. A similar extremism developed with regard to rules that prohibited particular foods, determined who can eat at the same table, and specified from whose hand a given could accept certain food. Caste and village studies in India, a combination of functionalism and Weberian approaches. Srinivas began his village ethnographic studies in the 1940s, and his later studies were influenced by those of Shah and Shroff. His theory and methodology was informed by the functionalist perspectives of Radcliffe Brown. Brown viewed lineage and kinship as the primary social unit through which Indian society was organized. Srinivas's primary concern was to assess the impact of modern practices of the state, such as adult franchisee, political party system and the economy, on the social structure of isolated communities. His assumptions were premised on the idea that the received social structure as a total entity which, while responding to exogenous influences, maintained its structural integrity. His queries related to how the caste system is responding to processes of representational politics. Foreign political authority, alongside with elements of social structure, was an endogamous variable operating within the social whole, a well-defined, more or less autonomous structural entity. It constituted one of the functional elements of the total social structure which ordered the arrangement of roles and determined one's social status in the stratificatory system of the community. Since the analysis focused exclusively on the internal changes in the social structure of a microcosmic entity, the discontinuities in the structure as well as the processes of structural interrogation taking place at a wider level of society through interactions between macro and micro processes were by and large ignored. This kind of an approach suggested a reaffirmation of the basic principle of India's traditional social structure. The new political forms were perceived as responding to the needs of the total social structure of the traditional order rather than as providing any serious challenge to its existence and continuation. Thus, Srinivas's research concluded that status mobility was still by and large a caste phenomena. An individual aspiring to a higher status cannot do so by moving out of the traditional status system. They can hope to improve the status only as members of a specific caste group, and in their effort to improve the status, they have to carry other members of the caste groups along with them. This is so because ritual status is still a predominant criteria of social stratification, and the acquisition of economic and political power by a status group in itself does not assure its rise in the social ladder. Srinivas argued that it was through the process of Sanskritization that social mobility could take place. He was also one of the first sociologists to examine the relationship between caste and politics. He introduced the concept of dominant caste to study power relations at village and local levels. Using the functionalist approach, similar kind of fieldwork was carried out by S.C. Dubey on caste dominance and factionalism taking place in the Jajmani system in rural areas. Similar research was carried out through the country using the framework of Sanskritization and dominant caste by S.K. Chauhan, S. Lal, T.K. Oman, Rastogi, K.L. Sharma, S.L. Srivastav to either confirm or conclusions made by Srinivas or contest them. The Srinivas and other ethnographers through the field studies came to the conclusion that the Varna model does not relate to the regional specificity and thus reality. In his view, caste is actually a jati which is region specific, and within the Varna hierarchy or categorizations there are innumerable jatis in any given spatial region, and the given hierarchy is always locally contested. Bete, that is Andre Bete, using Weberian framework concerned with the process of stability and change in society, was drawn to examine the influence of political forces on the system of social stratification. For him, political development was one of the independent variables alongside industrialization, urbanization and modern technology, which influenced the recognized social system. Thus, in his view, all elements in society were functionally integral, and hence he perceived the relationship between politics and social structure in a dichotomous framework of modernity and tradition. Thus, the village studies, ethnographies and historical studies of locales made it clear that caste was being shaped by modern political and economic forces of modernization. It was thus argued that the caste system had given way to a newly emergent market and the state. It was further observed that in this process of modernization led to dilution of the earlier way of societal organization, that is, system of ritual obligations and rights which once governed its economic and social existence and gave it an identity in terms of its status in the ritual hierarchy. Now, caste groups function more in terms of identity and status. Thus, while the sociologists and social anthropologists emphasize the resilience of caste, they also pointed out certain structural changes were taking place in the caste system, that is, as understood through the Varna hierarchy. While it is often conceded that the microcosms of jati still persist as primary social groups based on kinship and endogamy, though significant changes are noticeable even in this respect. It is at the same time recognized that with progressive differentiation of economic and power structures, new structural categories have been formed which are independent of and discontinuous with the early political organization of the social structure, and which cannot be discretely located in the Varna Jati scheme of caste stratification any longer. They argued that the new structural entities were political in nature and were called variously or characterized as social circles, social networks, political factions, or factional alignments. The second phase of caste study through the lens of political sociology. In the mid-1950s, Kothari and Maru, and later Rudolph and Rudolph, Hartgrave, Eliot, Sisson and Zelliot, Rosenthal explored the interface of caste with politics in India. They examined the interface between caste and politics and assumed that caste was exclusively a social phenomena that had its own principles through which it reproduced itself, and it was related to politics only at its interstices. They also argued that caste was an important conduit through which political mobilizations occurred, and that politics in turn politicized caste. However, there was no theorization to explicate how the economy, society, and polity are really enmeshed through the state. Moreover, this scholarship was informed and embedded in the functionalism of earlier social anthropological and social meanings of caste. Scholars such as Brass, Frankel and Rao, Kohli, Lele and Rao began interrogating the interrelationship between caste and politics with slightly different assumptions. This discourse assumed, just like the previous one, that the state's institutions and practices in the post-colonial period had inaugurated processes of structural differentiation and discontinuities in the received social order. The scholarship deviated from the earlier one, which viewed caste as one amongst the many constituents of social structure. Caste was not considered a singular principle of social networking and organization, but there were other ways of imagining social reality. They examined the operationalization of the various enmeshed social milieus interfacing with each other for generations and reproduction of political order. Other identities such as class, ethnicity, language and region were also given due importance in the schema. In the pursuit of exploring different contexts of political behavior, these scholars advanced theorizations of political power. It is no wonder then that these scholars were drawn to political sociology. These scholars conceive involvement of caste in politics as a process of politicization. Two divergent views of politicization, however, are discernible in this discourse. According to these scholars, politicization is a process that transcends primordial loyalty such as caste, religion and ethnic consideration, and introduces associational and non-ascriptive principles of political organization. The scholars, like the earlier ones, were more concerned in examining political processes rather than social structures. Thus, the scholars view the interaction between caste and politics in terms of process that has implication for generation and distribution of political power in society. The scholars contend that the process of political participation has opened up opportunities for recruitment of new elite. The mobilization through caste identities and support bases has led to schisms, new alignments, and members of these jatis as necessitated by exigencies of political parties, and thus gradually came to function as interest or pressure groups, undermining their social and ritual characteristics. The implications of these changes on caste structure, it is argued, has been of accretion and differentiation of roles, of fusion and fission of segments, of formation of new corporate groups of caste or caste associations, and of emergence of class-like structures within the framework of caste. However, it was the research of Frankel and Rao that attempted to bridge differences between various discourses on politics in India. There was a recognition that the earlier research on caste and politics could not effectively explain the organization of political power in India. It was by now accepted that caste was not the only variable through which political mobilization occurred. Frankel argues, to quote, such an analytical strategy emphasizes the importance of situational context in determining which one multiple identities will emerge as the primary in competition for social, economic and political advantage. The framework used in these volumes concentrates on changes introduced into society by modern state. This approach reckoned the caste, class, ethnicity and as heuristically distinct yet mutually interpenetrating domains. Unlike earlier research that limited itself to assessing the interface of caste with politics, this research was mapping regional variations of dominance and power through an interactional framework across disparate states, and also assessing how caste, class, ethnicity intersected and interfaced with the new political and economic institutions and processes to enable dominance of a few castes in different states. By contrast, the term power is used to refer to the exertion of secular authority by individuals appointed or elected to offices of the state who claim legitimacy under law to make and implement decisions binding on the population within their territorial jurisdiction. This distinction departs from the Weberian formulation of domination, which is often used interchangeably with authority. Rao admitted that prevailing notion of caste from earlier research was problematic, and for a project of this magnitude and complexity, one had to delineate the various received meanings of caste itself. In his endeavor to enlarge the notion of caste from its embedded location in Varna hierarchy, he re-theorizes caste such that it interrelates to class. Rao thus questioned the received understanding of caste, which is that caste is hereditary as a function of descent and as a closed endogamous group. He argues that this generalization ignores the role of social mobility, but he was also aware that some scholars employed a Weberian understanding and deemed caste as status group. He counters, to quote, "Following Weber's formulation of these conceptions, many sociologists and social scientists working on caste in India have equated it with status group. This has led to a serious misconception of the nature of caste and the caste system. To say the least, caste is not identical with status group. There are two notions in the concept of status group, namely status and group. Status is not collapsible with caste, as status obtains also in class and ethnic groups. Conversely, occupation, that is class position, is a part of the caste system. Moreover, caste as a group applies only to the sub-caste level. Caste at higher levels of structural order is a category which admits status differentiation and conflict within it. Although it has the potentiality of group formation under defined religious, social and economic conditions, it cannot be asserted that caste at higher structural levels is always a group. Therefore, Rao's question was, if social status is a common component of class and class, how are the determinants of status in caste different from those of status in class, and what are these? By raising these questions, Rao begins to interrogate relationship of class with caste. He is influenced by a Weberian conception of class, that this is a category of people whose situation is determined by the market wherein they share common economic interest in the possession of goods and opportunities for earning income. Classes as such were groups, and the social action that brought forth class situations is not basically action among members of identical class, but interaction among members of different classes. Social actions that directly determine the class situation of workers and the entrepreneurs are the labor market, the commodity market, and capitalist enterprise. In short, class was the kind of chance accessible to the individual in the market. He argued that caste system was only seen in context of religious ideology without reference to economic and political dimensions. To quote, "The caste system in the context of relations of production and exercise of power incorporates economic and political dimensions, and here the system of intercaste relations rather than caste category gains primary importance." Unquote. When relating to caste, he argues that status in a caste is determined by two criteria, economic as well as by ritual, social and educational consideration. To quote, "It is obvious that the source of legitimacy of the caste system in Hinduism is religious. This ideology also incorporated a material axis of status manifested in differential category. In turn, the material inequality among the different varnas is sustained by the religious belief system. At the jati level, specific jobs and occupations were associated with subcastes or sub-subcastes. The value behind the caste system invested callings and occupations with notions of purity and pollution, determining not only ritual hierarchy but also differential allocation of material resources. Thus, the economic basis of division of labor combined with the ritual status of purity and pollution, was responsible for differential access to material resources of production and differential allocation of rights as responsibilities. The production organization, which centered around land at the village level, was strengthened by the Jajmani system and patron-client relationships of service. It is also argued by the scholars that newer ways of interest articulation and ethnic formations in India, for instance, caste associations, have become part of modern political processes. In some cases, they form part of broader caste movements with a defined ideology engaged in collective mobilization. Under such circumstances, caste clusters tend to develop into larger ethnic blocs competing for ritual, economic, educational advantages and struggling against a position of subordination in a bid to gain positions of domination. To conclude then, this module tried to assess how the dominant caste in rural India and how politics of the modern Indian nation shaped interrelations between class, caste and power. It is also interesting to note that the village studies that were conducted from the 1950s and 60s onwards have also brought out new theoretical propositions, but the Weberian understanding of caste, class and power is also a very interesting mode of understanding how power is structured in the villages of India.